Hello and welcome to Outlook webinar. The coronavirus pandemic has certainly changed the world order. But what is the virus telling us? Is it making the world look more inward? What about the economic blow that it has dealt both to the country and the world? What about all those lakhs and lakhs of migrant laborers whom our cities have betrayed, who are walking all the way to the villages? Is the virus asking us to be more mindful, more conscious, and are we listening? To discuss these, to mull over these, and many more other things, we have with us politician, diplomat, author, social media star, orator, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor, thank you very much for joining Outlook webinar. It's a delight to have you.
Good to be with you, Satish. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir. I want to begin by asking, since you have such a vast experience in international relations, is the virus really making the whole world look more inward? Do you think trade barriers are only going to rise? The co-mingling of people, of cultures will come down?
I'm afraid so, yes. I think that we are seeing now a much greater insularity emerging, with countries becoming far more assertive of their own national interests, their own sovereignty, and their own need for protectionism. Already in our own country, we have Narendra Modi speaking of Atmanirbharta, self-reliance, as going to be the new default mode here. And in many countries in the Western world, the US in particular, we have seen an overt assertion of these elements at the expense of a tradition of global cooperation, of international solidarity, of support for multilateralism, all of which seem to be fraying at the edges. Even in the regional organizations, we take an organization like the European Union, which is considered a poster child in many ways for the entire notion of integration and cooperation and solidarity. What are you seeing? You're seeing very serious divisions within Europe. The Schengen visa regime has pretty much collapsed as countries have thrown up their own barriers to try and keep virus infected people out. You're seeing a situation in which an attempt to create corona bonds within Europe as an action of solidarity to help all of Europe to survive this crisis has actually created divisions rather than unity, because the so-called frugal four, the richer countries of the north, have refused to play along and go along with these bonds, saying that that they should not have to pay for the fecklessness or the financial irresponsibility of the other countries. So the whole notion of free movement of goods, services, capital, and people, which was at the heart of the European experiment, is itself collapsing. And in fact, the Spanish foreign minister rather bitterly said that we were all in one boat together, we hit an iceberg, and now we are quarreling about who will get first class and second class tickets on the lifeboats. I mean, that's the kind of situation that is dividing Europe. So everywhere that you look, I would argue that we are seeing more isolationism, more insularity, and more moving away from what had just a few years ago seemed an irresistible project of globalization, of cooperation, of internationalism. Now, de-globalization has become the new buzzword.
So, in this new world order, where do you think India will figure?
Well, I worry because I know where I believe India should figure. In fact, I've co-authored a book with Samir Saran that came out at the end of January, just before this whole lockdown and the virus pandemic swept across the world. And at that time, we argued passionately that some of these trends, which were already beginning to become apparent, needed to be resisted, and that India should play a constructive role in arguing for a new internationalism. We accepted the idea that the new world order created in 1945 was no longer new and no longer very orderly, that it had failed to live up to the new challenges of the 21st century, of new countries, new technologies, new ways of living that had come into being in the last generation or so. And it was therefore lacking in a certain amount of independence, autonomy, and legitimacy. So we wanted a change, but we wanted India to change it, not abandon it. So I worry when we hear slogans like self-reliance, because those were the mantras that in many ways had subtracted us from the world economy. Then, since 1991, India transformed itself, or reformed India transformed itself into a very well interlinked economy, But it seems that COVID has taught our government and many other governments that their principal preoccupation should be to reduce their dependence on global supply chains, because they didn't like being vulnerable to essential items being unavailable because other countries had their borders closed because of the virus. Now, we cannot, I think, realistically expect to relate or return to a world in which all countries are
But
going to be everything they need themselves. So it does worry me that India is heading that way.
as you were just saying about the United States and Europe, how we are more inward looking. So in a way, this self-reliance that Mr. Modi is talking about is in tune with that, isn't it?
That's precisely what it shouldn't be. I think India should be resisting this tendency from the Western world. We should be a strong and passionate advocate of the idea that all countries are safer when all countries are cooperating. Nehruji, at the moment of partition, when the flames were bursting across the land, when 13 million people had been displaced and a million butchered in those riots, on the midnight moment of 1947, in his Tryst with Destiny speech, he said, "My dreams are not only for India, but for the world, because the world is all united, peace is indivisible, that nations and their problems in this one world cannot be seen and taken apart." Now, that's 75 years ago. We cannot, 75 years later, go for America first, India first, sovereignty, borders, as if we have not learned any of the lessons that led to the creation of the world order back in 1945 in the first place. Don't forget, it was created because of the horrors of the first half of the 20th century, when you had so many wars, so many civil wars, two world wars, the Holocaust, Hiroshima. That was the kind of world that the leaders of 1945 realized would destroy the planet. And they said, no, we must create a system, a world to ensure that that never happens again. And that surely is a set of values that we would like to celebrate in the 21st century, is an improved version of that world order that ensures we don't go back to the horrors of the first half of the 20th century. Instead, if we learn the wrong lessons, we retreat behind our own barriers, then I think disaster is simply inevitable later down the road.
In terms of in containing the pandemic and, the mortality rate itself, actually India seems to have done rather well, relatively speaking. So, won't you, isn't that because of the steps that this government has taken, say, in quick time?
Yes and no. Yes, it is true that we have done rather well in comparison with, say, the US, UK, Italy, Spain. But it's also not true we have done well enough if you want to compare with South Korea, Singapore, even China. Right now, our our caseload toll has equaled that of China. We're also at about 80,000. And if you look at the way in which our caseload figures keep going up, we clearly haven't ended the virus at all. We're not out of the woods yet. But I would say that the lockdown was necessary. I think it could have been planned better so that the needs of the migrant workers and others could have been taken care of.
Yeah.
And it could have also been accompanied by adequate relief measures for the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable and marginalized sections of our society. But that objection apart, it could also have been about 10 days earlier. I think it's a bit reprehensible that at a time when the government clearly could see what was going wrong in other countries, that they kept an illusion of normality essentially in order to bring down the government in Madhya Pradesh. Because if, for example, Parliament had been suspended and all these other issues and meetings had not been taking place, then the argument for suspending the Madhya Pradesh Legislative Assembly would also have been high. And the BJP decided really to risk many, many lives by keeping India open for business, as it were, until they had succeeded in toppling that government. That I thought was most unfortunate. But once we overlook that, and once we say that there should have been better planning, I would agree with you that many of the things we've done are right. But do not be complacent. We have still got people infected and getting infected every day. And even if the rate of doubling is slowing down, common sense tells us that it'll always take less time to double from 100 to 200 than it will take to double from 10,000 to 20,000 and from 20,000 to 40,000. So I would not draw so much heart from the rate of doubling. I would look at the raw numbers and ask myself, how many Indians are infected, are we able to treat all of them, do we have enough testing kits for all of them, do we have enough hospital facilities for all of them, do we have enough protective equipment for the doctors and nurses and healthcare workers to take care of them? And if you look at all of this, the short answer, I'm afraid, is not yet. So we are not there yet, and certainly not in a position to issue
In
any
fact,
commitment.
we have a question from one of the viewers, Mr. S.M. Hussain. He wants to know if you were the Prime Minister of the country, what are the one or two things you would have done differently?
Well, I think the ones I've already hinted at, Satish. Number one, I would have moved faster than the government did. We did have information by late July, by late January, I beg your pardon, when the WHO said it was going to declare as a pandemic. We could have acted, I would say, and moved to a lockdown by the end of February. We could have learned a lot from the way Kerala handled it extremely effectively, where the WHO mantra of test, treat, trace, and isolate was done very, very effectively in Kerala, but nowhere else in India. We would have also done much more community participation, got more people involved, instead of suddenly at 4 hours' notice shutting down all the trains and buses. We would treat our citizens as rights-bearing individuals, give them time to go home if they must, or shelter them and feed them or accommodate them where they are in cities if it's not possible for them to go home. A lot of these elements of paying attention to the most vulnerable sections of our society is what's indispensable, and we didn't do that. Ideally, the migrant workers would have been protected where they are and fed. It's people who are starving who feel, well, if we're going to have nothing to eat, we may as well go home where at least somebody will give us something, and they set off on that trudge homeward. Home is also where people tend to feel more secure, and therefore to cut off the means they have of getting home was rather unwise. All of this, I think, could have been done better. But at the end of the day, one last and important point I would stress that should have been done differently and can still be done differently is to decentralize more decision making. This is supposed to be not just a federal country, but a country with more local self-government institutions. Instead of taking every decision in Delhi, which is in my view crazy, we should be empowering literally people at the level of a district. It is actually absurd for a joint secretary in Delhi, as has been pointed out by the same of the Punjab, to be shutting down an entire district because there are two cases there, when both those cases are in one house and that house could have been contained, or that building could have been contained. You can't have this kind of logic of top down. But the government has actually ridden roughshod over our federalism. And when, for example, the state of Kerala at the end of April wanted to ease up certain facilities in those districts that were virus free and permit traffic and movement of buses and so on, the cabinet secretary wrote a very stern letter, or was it the home secretary, in any case in Delhi, wrote a stern letter to Kerala saying, you cannot do this, it's a violation of a national directive. Well, there shouldn't be national directives micromanaging what states and even lower levels in states, the village levels, the ward levels, the district levels, should be the ones making the decisions.
Yeah.
That's the way we can get India back on track. So that's one more thing I would have done.
In a big country like ours, each part has its own specific problems. I mean, it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of strategy, right?
Yeah, I agree. And I've been arguing for some time that this is not only wrong and unwise, but it's also unconstitutional. The Constitution envisages us as a country with separate state administrations. The constitutional amendment that created the Panchayati Raj Act has also empowered local self-government institutions. We should trust them to do their job and know their people around them.
Yeah. Dr. Tharoor, I want to ask you, now that we have this, this migrant workers problem, I mean, it is really a humanitarian issue, actually, in many ways. Yeah, what are your thoughts? I mean, how will they ever come back to, the cities which betrayed them so badly? How will they ever trust, an employer who's not paid them, the measly amount that is owed to them? It's a sense of betrayal, and it's really a big issue, isn't it? How are we ever going to come out of that?
I agree with you. I think that many individuals will not find it possible to trust the system, trust their previous employers, and trust even the idea of being far away from home, because home, at least, they feel a certain sense of psychological security. That will not easily disappear. Nonetheless, we already saw, for example, in the Rabi crop harvest in Punjab and Haryana, that workers were willing to come back, some of them, in sufficient numbers that a significant harvest was conducted. So ultimately, the economic imperative, if you are going to be paid more than you're earning at home from Manrega, you may still come, but you may then want to go back home. Seasonal employment may still work. Whether the fellows from Bihar who were working in factories in Mumbai and factories that were shut down and didn't pay them and took no responsibility for them, didn't house them, didn't feed them, whether they will go back is another question. But the factory owners may well gamble. They'll get others willing to go because obviously we were facing record levels of unemployment before the coronavirus struck. We had the worst figures in our country's history in 45 years. And now I think we're going to see even much higher figures because the unemployment rate is probably over 60% in the country right now. We don't have an exact figure. All I can say is that I think that therefore desperate people may actually make the trek back to work, but they'll want some assurances, and those assurances will have to be given and well publicized.
Yeah. The other thing this pandemic has shown is actually the importance of investing in health and health schemes. It's instead of maybe so much in defense, it's probably better to invest more in health. It seems. I mean, this is definitely. In fact, we have on that too. Like Hirtiman Sharma from Guwahati wants to know if there is a way that possible for health insurance for all. Then Savita Swayambhu from Noida wants to know that is it the time to actually increase funding for research, in health.
So these are themes, if you look at my speeches over the last 4 or 5 years, that I've been hammering away at, and no one was listening to me. 3 years ago, I chaired a roundtable with an NGO partner in Delhi asking why is it that public health has so little salience politically? Why is it that no political representative, when he goes back to his constituency, is asked to fight for public health issues, to fight for more resources, better hospitals, and so on? With the possible exception of Kerala, I don't find public health becoming a political issue. Now, finally, the coronavirus may actually change that. You know that this government has spent 1.28% of GDP is all they have spent on public health. And it's not as if that's a significant sum for a country our size. It's a trivial sum. And I'm not suggesting we should spend like the US, which is several multiples of that. But if even China spend almost 6% of GDP on public health, we are clearly severely lacking. And I think this is the time to do that. I've also been arguing that we don't spend enough money on research. I wasn't only talking about medical research, but your questioner has obviously talked about that, the importance of medical research, but all kinds of research should get more funding, both from the public and the private sectors. We should create a set of incentives. I mean, the government certainly should give whatever it can for our researchers, but the private sector would give more if we created more tax incentives to do so. Why is it that, for example, in America, a company that wants to devise something can go to a university and say, listen, if you have doctoral students or postdoctoral students who can do this work, here is the seed money. You research it, you invent the product, we'll manufacture it, we'll give you a share of the profits. That kind of thing never happens in India. We need to start engaging academia with industry. We need to start engaging private capital with research. We need to start putting in more tax money into public health expenditure. And we need to make public health more important politically so that people really start contesting elections, saying, I will fight for your health, I will fight for universal health insurance, as your first question asked, I will fight for a cleaner environment so you have fewer respiratory illnesses. I've been conducting myself and chairing a round table for 3 years now on clean air, and it gets so little traction. Now here in Delhi, for the first time in the 11 years I've been an MP, and in reality for the first time in 25, 30 years, you can see the skies and the clouds and breathe the air. It's unbelievably performing. Will the residents of Delhi be willing to sacrifice what they have now experienced for a month? I hope not. I hope they'll turn around and say to whoever's ruling Delhi, we don't want to go back to choking air with the worst pollution, the worst air pollution in the entire world was Delhi's. We don't want that distinction anymore. We want what we had in April and May. If we can see that kind of pushback, I think we will be able to transform our country.
But do you think, are we going to learn? I mean, are we going to learn from this, or once the lockdown is over, we're just going to like go back to what we used to be, doing?
You're a pessimist, Satish. I'm not. I'm a chronic optimist. I believe people are capable of learning. I believe people are capable of actually drawing the right conclusions from the evidence before their very eyes. And the truth is that this is such a great opportunity for the government to reboot everything, because essentially, thanks to the coronavirus, the government is now seeing a golden opportunity to, first of all, escape the blame for all that was going wrong before the virus. That is, the
Yeah,
economic collapse, unemployment figures, the terrible burden on the exchequer, the divisive political climate thanks to the CAA and the NRC. It could really move beyond that and actually start a sort of a Modi government, not 2.0, because that already began a year ago, but maybe 2.1 or 2.5, where they can say, no, we are moving away from the divisive agenda of Hindutva. We want to now focus on rebuilding and economic development. We're moving away from some of the traditional patterns of doing things. We're going to
yeah.
completely transform the economic incentives, the regulatory incentives. We're going to stop giving insane targets to our revenue officials that prompt them to conduct tax terrorism on people. We're going to give incentives for both Indian businessmen and foreigners to invest in our economy. We're going to put more money in alternative energy so we have cleaner air. We're going to put more public health so that our people don't have to live in fear of the next pandemic. All of these things can be done. It's not difficult. All it needs is political will. And if this is not an excuse to manifest that political will, I don't know what is.
Other going forward, this social distancing is going to be, it's not only till the lockdown, it's going to be a sort of a norm, I think, for a while now. But in a country, we're a country of crowds. There's Kumbh Mela, a lack of people in a cricket stadium, jamaats, congregations. However, are we going to maintain social distance?
That's an excellent question, Satish, because we ourselves, India in particular, as a politician, I can tell you I'm constantly amid crowds. And what I see is that crowds are almost the default mode for our nation and the way in which we actually express ourselves. I really would worry about that aspect quite rightly, because you are looking at an India in which social distancing, which in any case is the wrong word, we really mean physical distancing. Social
Yeah,
distancing is something we need to object to because we want society to come closer
yeah,
together, bring together. But physical distancing is literally an impossibility for the majority of our population. Not only are they always in crowds, they're traveling in crowded buses or trains to crowded workplaces. They're coming back to very crowded homes and living often cheek by jowl in large numbers in one room or one tiny apartment. So these are the realities that the vast majority of India experiences. And for them, clearly, the excuse that we need physical distancing is not going to cut much ice. So I think protective gear, effective hospitals and treatment for those who are badly infected, effective home remedies and treatments for those who can be treated at home. All of that's going to be indispensable until a vaccine is found. And when it is, we are fortunately the world's biggest vaccine manufacturers. We should be manufacturing 1.3 billion of these vaccines urgently in order to protect our population so they can go back to their normal lives. But I still that normal will be redefined to include a certain amount of respect for distance, a certain amount of consciousness of the dangers of infection, greater hygiene,
yeah.
more running water and more use of running water to wash hands, more use of soap. Even a clean state like Kerala, you'll get water everywhere to wash your hands, but you won't get soap in 9 places out of 10. And this is something I've really started carrying my own soap around in Kerala. That has to change. We really have to understand how important these things are for public health. And I think that that kind of modified normal life will probably be more likely than a totally new normal. But that's the way it's going to have to be until a vaccine is found.
The other thing that this virus has compelled us to rethink is, this work-life balance. Actually, family. Many people feel that family is becoming more important. This work out of home is could be a new norm. E-learning. It has thrown up a whole lot of new concepts. Do you think many of these would continue? We will continue to adapt.
Yeah, I think we're going to see some real significant changes in the ability to work virtually. Obviously, that's precisely for white collar workers only. But a lot of us who
How is it being
currently
as a politician for you to work from home? How is it? How are you planning to take off
I've actually
physical?
been very, very effective. The things that I've not been able to do have been things like mingling with crowds, visiting patients in hospitals, waving at people, the kind of political stuff that's meant to be the kind of photo of politics that every politician who needs to get elected has to do. But what I've been able to do, I've been able to get urgent personal protective equipment to my healthcare workers in Trivandrum. I've been able to get 3,000 test kits, the first ones made in India, delivered to my constituency. We became the first place in India to get them, the RT-PCR test kits. I was able to bring the first thermal scanner for an airport into my airport. I was able to bring all sorts of other kinds of relief. Obviously, when my constituents stranded abroad have come to me for help, I've been able to work with the foreign minister and the civil aviation minister on the phone, by the internet, by WhatsApp, in ways that would obviously make no difference whatsoever whether I was sitting in my
Yeah.
constituency or in Delhi. So, in many, many ways, my effectiveness has not even been slightly impaired. My political sort of photo of politics may have been impaired, but that should be the least important thing. As for you, I suspect that you are able to do a lot of your editorial work, writing, editing, commissioning, all of that, sitting at home. You don't need to physically be in an office to produce a magazine. And these are the kinds of things people will discover more and more. And I believe that not only will this move forward, it will change two things. First, it should change, I hope, our government's attitude to the communications revolution. They've been very miserly with spectrum allocation. I think all our commercially and civilian available spectrum is less than 3% of the total spectrum in the country. Most of it is hogged by the military. They should release more spectrum. India currently has one of the slowest broadband speeds in the world. We are something like 92nd or 93rd out of 120 countries measured. We should be able to dramatically increase our broadband speed if we realize how important it is for people to be able to work on Wi-Fi. And
Yeah.
finally, it may change even urban planning. One of the reasons physical distancing is impossible for so many people is the
Yes.
fact that they live in congested urban environments because all their work is in offices, factories, and so on. Now, if at least the white collar work can be dispersed, it should be possible for us to finally fulfill President Abdul Kalam's excellent vision of providing urban facilities in rural areas. Why should a business process outsourcing office that is answering a phone call in from Boston about a credit card or a washing machine that needs repair or whatever, why should that office be in Gurgaon? Why can't it
Yeah.
be in Jhumri or in some village? As long as
Absolutely.
you have broadband connectivity, guaranteed 24/7 electricity, you can do that. So our entire urban planning, our prediction of more demographic flight from rural to urban, all of that can change
Yeah.
provided we invest in the right infrastructure, the right technological infrastructure.
In fact, the power of the internet. In fact, Indranil Roy from Delhi wanted to know that do you think political rallies will change in the forthcoming elections? People will use the power of the internet more and more.
Well, yes and no. Because the fact is that we still can't reach a majority of our voters on the through the power of the internet alone. Um, I would say that rallies will continue when possible. Right now, they're not possible. Even if the lockdown is eased and partially lifted in the next few weeks, I don't see rallies happening because it's impossible to prevent spread of infection there. In any case, my understanding is that any easing or lifting is going to be linked to the idea that mass gatherings will not be permissible for a while yet, including cinema, theaters, and so on. So why would you permit a political rally either? But I would say that two things will happen. Yes, there will be more resort to modern means of communication, internet, and so on. But secondly, there will also be people waiting to see how much they can do when the restrictions are fully lifted, and we may see a reversion to the worst habits of politics. In my state, already People have been conducting their usual dharnas, protest marches, gathering sit-down strikes outside the secretariat. They're wearing masks, but they're still close to each other. And I do worry this is not entirely wise. Already we've had a controversy in Kerala where 5 Congress MPs and MLAs have been ordered by the state government to go into self-quarantine because they were conducting a dharna at the checkpoint with the Tamil Nadu border. And at that checkpoint, while they were all there, one of the people who came through was an COVID-infected person. So under the rules that Kerala has rightly and strictly imposed in the past, they've been ordered to isolate. And of course, this is seen by my party MPs and MLAs as an infringement on political freedom. So even the rules of politics are under threat, Satish. And I would say we will have to see how we can conduct this kind of politics. A lot will depend on what the data shows us in the next few weeks and months. If the virus gets worse in May and June, as some people are fearing, and we cross a lakh of cases and we start getting 40, 50,000 fatalities eventually, if we have that kind of dramatic change, then I think everybody will sober up and retreat to a sort of revival of the first lockdown kind of spirit. Right now, the feeling everyone is itching to get back to the ways they are used to. They're accustomed to certain ways of living, behaving, politicking, and so on, and therefore they contain themselves. It would take a fresh round of bad news to force them to restrain themselves, in my view.
One other big change has been this e-learning. Schools and colleges learning on the computer, on the phone. Ishani Tipu from Chicago is asking, is this is a great way to take education to the weaker sections of the society? In some way, it is actually democratization of education.
Yes and no. Again, I am actually a small skeptic on the subject of how well this argument has actually been convincingly made. I know that people are arguing that the online education, the growth of educational technology is now completely enabled by this COVID virus. It is certainly true that many people have been taking courses of all sorts of things, university courses, language courses. I even heard about a cricketer who has been taking courses from an Australian website. And the estimate is that this year, the amount of spending on educational technology will be about 250 billion, which will, of course, be an old record. And venture capitalists are already seeing this as a fertile sector. They've invested $1.5 billion in edtech companies even before COVID, and it's going to increase. Having said that, there are 2 or 3 concerns I have. Number one, we're overlooking the reality of a country like India. I already mentioned our weak broadband speeds. We not only have very poor Wi-Fi connectivity in many parts of the country, we also have very unreliable electricity. So where you can't be guaranteed 24/7 electricity, I have a Sarkari bungalow in Lutyens, Delhi, and yet I have at least one power cut every couple of days. And it's sometimes a power cut of only a few minutes. Sometimes it can be 2 hours. And that's because we never mastered the basic art of electricity distribution. It's much worse in many, many rural areas. Secondly, everyone, you ask a student, you ask a teacher, there is no substitute to face-to-face education, face-to-face education experience. It's interesting, in America, they've done a survey that has established that large numbers of high school seniors who would normally be expected to go into university by August, September of this year are instead opting to take a gap year because they don't want to experience university education on a computer screen. They want to go for education when they can actually mingle with people, have fun, have relationships, experience campus life, and so on. For all of these things, I don't think that education technology is going to be a substitute for instructor-led education. It is only going to be a supplement. And I would say again, in India, if you want, for example, a lecture in IIT Delhi to be heard by a student in a little village in Madhya Pradesh, you're going to need a teacher standing by that computer screen, explaining and maybe translating some of the lecture to the students assembled if you want that lecture to benefit the student. It's not as if every person in the educational space is equally well equipped to imbibe what he is hearing on the screen and learn it. And therefore, I think it's important to understand both the promise and the limits of online education.
Hmm. Dr. Tharoor, you're also a prolific writer and an observer of human nature, and most sort of world events they shape art and literature in a certain way. How do you think this pandemic is going to influence literature? And say, what are the thoughts as a writer in your head?
Well, my own thoughts are actually linked to what I'm writing. I finished a long pending a book and then began and have already done a first draft of a serious book I've been anxious to write for some time on nationalism. So all my reading and writing has been focused on nationalism in the course of this lockdown, except when I've been reading and writing and speaking and acting on COVID, because that's been the other main preoccupation. So COVID takes up 8 hours a day, and writing about nationalism takes up another 3 or 4. But don't take me as typical. I'll tell you 2 or 3 things that have happened. Number one, there's been a tremendous desire to keep literature, art, and culture alive in the virtual space. I myself have done at least a dozen different webinars and seminars with literature festivals, discussions on my books. There are book clubs that have gone online. I've addressed, for example, the Prabha Khaitan Foundation did an event which brought together readers from 7 cities simultaneously. Now, I was lamenting that literature festivals can't take place in these conditions, and many of my literary festival invitations were cancelled. But think about this way. At least when I go to the Jaipur Literary Festival, I'm only in Jaipur. Here I'm sitting in Delhi and addressing readers in 8 cities. So all those things have happened, and that's been one positive development that has come out of this whole process. The second thing is that writers have had the time and the mental space to focus on the larger questions that might be agitating them. We are all people who have to keep up with the frenetic pace of life. Very few writers actually manage to cut themselves off. Here, everybody's been able to think, and there might therefore be good literature, maybe even great literature coming out of the pandemic. It's often pointed out that one of the great classics of the Western canon, which has been in print since 1340, is Boccaccio's Decameron, which was written actually during the famous Black Death plague. We've had great writing coming out of the plague in Elizabethan England, including some works of Shakespeare. So there is no question that when people are forced to stay indoors, stay safe, stay secure, and avoid infection, avoid illness, it gives them time for a more deeper, more profound interior life. And that can produce great literature. So I actually think that that literature will get a boost out of this. We hear Orhan Pamuk is writing a new book. He's written a wonderful essay about some of the plague literature. People are dusting off the great books about pandemics, including Camus' Immortal the Plague. There is now a lot of realization about the nature of human life, about the nature of the threat that has confronted us, and about the possibility that it can recur. It's been years since something as calamitous swept the world, and that was the so-called Spanish flu of 1918-19. This time or next time, it may be much sooner. It may be a few years, 20 years, 10 years. So this has concentrated the minds of writers and thinkers, and I hope that as a result, great books will emerge from this process.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor. It's a delightful conversation we had. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it, all the viewers, as much as I did talking to Dr. Tharoor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed that very much, and good talking to you, Satish. All the best to Outlook at these difficult times.
Thank you for your time.
Take care. Thanks.